I guess I'm going to ask, but before we kind of get into what you do and how you do it when you're working with a client, when you're working with an attorney, I'll ask the kind of ultimate question, and we'll ask both of them. When you step into a case and you start evaluating the situation, what is parental alienation, and how do you evaluate that side of things? And then we'll go to the domestic violence side after that.
Sure. I think of parental alienation as deliberate, conscious attempts on the part of a parent to turn a child or children against the other parent without a rational basis. Okay? It is often, if not almost always, something that the alienating parent does to meet their own emotional needs. It's not child-centered, it's parent-centered. It's either reactive or in some ways, it's retribution towards the parent that they're trying to toxify the child against. But it's basically a deliberate attempt on the part of the parent to alienate the children from the other parent without a cause. Okay. They are So what are some of the characteristics? Let me tell you about a case I did many years ago. It was a child custody case. It was a relocation case. The mother in this case wanted to move from the city that the child and the father and the family were living in to another city, still in California. And so I met with the mother. And in my first interview with the mother, I said to the mother, "Tell me about what your goals are and why." And she said some things to me about why she felt the relocation was appropriate and so forth. Okay, I won't parrot what she said. A few weeks later, I met the kid for the first time. Bring the kid into my office, and I say to the kid, "Tell me why you're here. What's going on?" And the child began to parrot the mother's statements almost on a word-for-word basis. Okay? So one of the signs, it's not by in any means in and of itself conclusive, but a sign that alienation may be going on is when children's narratives, children's words, children's reasons, children's thinking parrots their parents' thinking very closely, sometimes word for word, and often express themselves in a way that is not developmentally appropriate. It might be too sophisticated, too advanced. And when you interview them, and they may use a word, and you'll say to the kids, "Susie, what does that word mean?" And they don't even know. Okay. Another sign of a child who may be fallen into an alienating dynamic is an inability to verbalize strengths on the part of the parent that they're rejecting, or weaknesses on the part of the parent that they're aligned with. They may have difficulty recalling any pleasant memories with the parent that they're rejecting. And they may have difficulty recalling any unpleasant memories with the parent that they're accepting. Their rejection is without ambivalence. It is black and white. And the reason that's important is that children, even children who are seriously mistreated by a parent, will demonstrate ambivalence about the parent who has hurt them. They'll still have a love-hate relationship with them. When it's well known, for example, when child welfare, CPS, goes into a home to remove a child because that child is being endangered by a parent, that most of the time, even though the children are risk and harmed, they protest leaving the parent who's harmed them. So in alienation, we see the child kind of tie it all up with a neat little ribbon in a black and white way. So these are some of the signs we see that would lead us to be more concerned that alienation may be taking place. Now, the other side of the street, you asked me about domestic violence. And I want to say, first of all, that when we think about domestic violence, we also need to think very broadly. Many of us, if not most of us in the lay community, think about domestic violence in terms of hitting, battering, striking, kicking, biting, slapping, things like that, physical violence. Domestic violence is a whole lot more than that. Okay. Yes, battering is domestic violence. Yes, slapping, biting, punching is domestic violence. But so is isolating somebody from their support system. So is verbally demeaning them in certain kinds of ways. So is depriving them access to financial resources so that they can go and do things independently. So is something we call coercive control, which is where we act in ways towards another person to intimidate them and make them afraid of doing anything that might upset us, and results in their feeling a loss of their own agency, a loss of their own efficacy, a loss of their ability to act successfully in the world. So domestic violence is a very, very, very broad term. And I want to point out that I think it was last year, I can't remember exactly, but the family code was explicitly amended to include non-physical forms of domestic violence in the code defining DV, domestic violence.
Yeah, 2021, we had coercive control get explicitly added. Yeah.
No, it was explicitly added. Not that those of us who know DV needed that to be done, because we always understood that coercive control was a domestic violence tactic, but it was not widely enough understood, so it was explicitly added by the law, so that now it must be considered. I mean, sadly enough, I've been in courtrooms where judges said, well, there's no DV here because the father never laid a hand on her. So you want to pull your hair out because that's the judge. Now the judge has that instruction. So what do we do with respect to domestic violence and this assessment? Well, there's a number of screening tools, a number of screening protocols and assessment protocols available. Obviously, we ask a lot of questions. And one of the things with domestic violence that we often want to do is ask third parties, things that they've seen, heard, been told. We want to, when we assess domestic violence, we want to make sure to do it in a very structured and systematic way. And so I use different kinds of rubrics or protocols. There's a protocol called SAFER, SAFER. That's excellent. There are interview protocols put up on the National Institutes of Child Health and Development. So we want to see if there have been forms of domestic violence, and we look not only at whether it has happened, but its frequency, its duration, its intensity, and the way it, particularly with physical violence, how it's perpetrated, how likely is it to be lethal, and for somebody to be seriously injured or unfortunately killed. And as I think most people know, if there's a relationship between two people and one of them ends up dead, the first person the police look for is the intimate partner, right? So a lot of those kinds of deaths can be attributable to DV as opposed to a stranger.
Yeah, I think that's a big one for dads too that get involved in family court, is that it does not have to be physical. And I know you spend quite a bit of your year in California. Out here, we have one of the more broad statutes in terms of defining what domestic violence is. So that's something that in first conversation I have is domestic violence is not hitting your soon-to-be ex, your ex-girlfriend, whatever it may be. There's a whole list of things that can account for domestic violence.
Well, and there's something else important about domestic violence, and particularly for the audience that I think we have today, a male audience. With the exception of battery, of physical violence, domestic violence it shows gender symmetry. What I mean by that is that men are as often the victims of domestic violence as are women. Yes, we are victims too. When it comes to physical violence, it's much more often than not male on female for any number of reasons, not the least of which is men are stronger. Men are taller, men have more muscle. Men can force themselves more physically. But men can be victims of psychological violence, financial violence, all kinds. And that's important because we men, sometimes our egos get in the way. Our male ego, our pride gets in the way of our recognizing that we're being mistreated by our spouse.
Yeah.
So I want to mention that to this audience, right?
And here's the thing I see, I think, most commonly is that men are the ones who are they are afraid to bring it up. I've had clients that have come in that, hey, in 2018, she stabbed me. And then I declined to cooperate with the police. And now we're breaking up. And the judge is like, well, what's happened the last 3 or 4 years since you're saying you allegedly got stabbed and then failed to cooperate?
So yes, men are reluctant to report even when it's obvious they've been physically harmed, but they often don't report the other forms of domestic violence or even recognize that they have been on the receiving end of it. And while it is true from a sexual perspective that, men are not typically the victims of sexual violence, they absolutely can be. And we need to recognize that men can be a victim of sexual violence, and it doesn't need to mean rape. It can mean any number of different kinds of things. One of the things I think that's critically important when we talk about resist, refuse, and whether domestic violence is at play is to remember that domestic violence is not a uniquely male issue. It is a gender symmetrical issue, except for the battery piece of it. And the majority of DV, in my experience, that I've seen in my cases over the years, has not been physical.
I would tend to agree. And I'll make this statement, and you can agree or disagree. But when you talk about the non-physical, the non-battery domestic violence, you almost always see, if one side's alleging it, usually there was some form of domestic violence being reciprocated.
Well, there's something we call mutual couples combat, okay, where both members of the couple, when they're extremely stressed, when they're particularly angry, when they're highly frustrated, their coping skills break down and they act out physically, and then it subsides, and then it can reoccur, and then it can subside. So even physical violence has different forms, different types, if you will. Not so one of the things I always get concerned about in my cases is if there is domestic violence, that we're careful to describe the type of it. And I'm not just saying whether it's physical or not physical, financial, whatever, spiritual, emotional, but for example, a number of couples in the throes of separation, when the relationship is breaking down and it becomes obvious to one or both members of the couple that they need to separate, or that separation is imminent, particularly when children are in the family, the stresses, the strains, the internal pressures are beyond description. And they are the kinds of emotional, psychological pressures that these men and women have never experienced before, because they've never been through it before. And they are profound. I cannot emphasize enough how powerful they are. And at times like that, people's coping skills break down, right? They may throw a phone across the room. They may may call their spouse terrible, terrible names that they've never used before. They may strike their spouse or shove their spouse. And it may be limited to that passage in the history of that family where that couple's falling apart, where the seams are being ripped. We call that separation instigated intimate partner violence, which is very different in its nature than a pattern of violence between a couple that's chronic and takes place over time. And so it's important to distinguish between the types of violence, because the kinds of things that need to be done, the kinds of interventions we need to use will vary. For example, in a separation instigated domestic intimate partner violence situation, the answer is to get into two separate homes, right? Mm-hmm. And it's very, very, and it's very time limited there. It's very unlikely to reoccur, as opposed to the answer being filing a domestic violence restraining order and getting a restraining order against somebody. That is a very important tool that we can use, but it needs to be used in cases where the likelihood of ongoing violence is really present. So we've got separation instigated violence. We've got something we call mutual couples violence, which is these episodes of inappropriate behavior that is bilateral, takes place on the part of both parties. And it's part of a chronic cycle. And again, it often is bilateral. What we really worry about is the kind of violence that is more chronic coercive control and typically unidirectional, one partner against the other, where that way of coping with dissatisfaction, frustration, being told no, not being in charge, is very much baked into that person's personality. And they don't have the stop rule in them. And by the way, like, for example, in the separation instigated violence, after the phone is thrown across the room or the horrible insult is hurled at the other person, there's regret, there's guilt, there's true remorse. Okay. In coercive controlling violence, there's only remorse because I got caught and I might get consequences. Right. And that's why we need the restraining orders.
And I think, I mean, being representing men, I find myself probably 90% of the time defending domestic violence restraining orders. And it's almost exclusively the phenomena you describe as kind of the lack of coping skills and going through the separation. And I think I'll finish this thought and then I'll pass it to you. And I find that what it ends up doing is when we look at those situations, and I'm not going to comment on California law, and how they deal with it, but I find it cheapens and it puts individuals who are in that are victims of domestic violence and there's extreme risk of it continuing. It cheapens when they tell people what's going on, when they report these instances. And a lot of times you have situations where we don't get the nuance of, say, someone like yourself laying out what's going on.
It's the unfortunate thing is that there are unfortunately too many situations where a spouse needs to be protected. Mm-hmm. There's also too many situations where there is an unfortunate episode once, twice between a couple, and one of the parties goes to court with a domestic violence restraining order as a tactic to gain the upper hand in the custody battle because of the way that California law is. What I find is when an attorney is defending a domestic violence restraining order, and it appears to the attorney that the type of DV is likely not the coercive control DV or the real chronic DV, it can be helpful to bring an expert in to educate the court at the domestic violence hearing about the typologies of domestic violence. Now, that expert will not be able to tell the court, this is the kind of violence in this family, because they will not have done their own evaluation. But many judges find it helpful when experts can explain to them that that domestic violence with different dynamics needs different responses from the court, and they want to deliver the effective response. So
Yeah,
experts
I
can
think
be
that's a
really
big
helpful
thing.
when your clients, have the resources to hire an expert.
Yeah, which whole nother issue with family court and what goes on there is the resources. But
Absolutely. Absolutely.